let's take a look at this session. We're going to take a look at how to discover and use what your church does well. And again, you can find the notes here. And you can use the either URL directly or use the QR code, and you can get there. The QR code actually goes to what's called Linktree, and it'll give you a direct link to the website. So saving the QR code won't help you later, because at the next conference I'll change that one to the next notes. But if you go to SWMO21, if you go to that suffix of KarlVaters.com, that will always stay there, and these notes from these sessions will always be up there, and you can reference them later if you want to. So, in southern Indiana, there is a wide spot in the road that the locals call Kurtz. It is not actually officially a town. It is not registered on the census every 10 years. If you Google Kurtz, Indiana, it will show you Kurtz, Indiana. But if you Google Morton, Indiana, or any of the towns immediately nearby it, which is 30, 40 miles away, Kurtz will not show up on your map because it does not exist as a town. Now, several years ago, I spoke at a conference there because it was central to the churches in that area, and we finished the conference at this little church in this wide spot on the road. And I was talking with the pastor afterwards, and have you ever been to a church and you can tell the difference between the clutter of abandonment and the clutter of regular use? Right, there's a difference, right? This had the clutter of regular use. So I asked him, give me a look around the facility. It didn't take long, small little church. And at the end of it, we're standing in the pastor's office, and I said, I don't mean to be rude by the question, but this feels like a really active church, is it? He goes, yeah, it's a really active church. And I said, I really don't mean to be rude, but how? There's nobody here. Like, we drove for, I can't remember how long, through nothing but cornfields until all of a sudden here's this church and a couple houses over here. Are we just on this end? Is the town on the other side of you? He goes, no, it's just cornfields on the other side too. So how is this an active church? He said, well, actually, that's part of my story. So tell me that story then. Okay, he says, I've been here for 6 years. He said, for the first 4 years, about all we did was bury church members. I mean, it was one funeral after another, after another, after another. He said, finally, about 2 years ago, I'm sitting at yet another funeral reception. And I'm sitting there and I'm just complaining to the Lord, like, God, why do you have me here? In the middle of nowhere, and literally all I'm doing is burying this church one body at a time. What's going on here? And then he said, I thought, the only thing we do well is funeral receptions because we do so many of them. And then he said, it hit me, we do this well. We do funeral receptions well. So he said, I went to the funeral director for the area, and I walked in and I told him, here's the deal. I want to offer you something. Every time anybody comes with a relative who's passed, any funeral that happens in Kurtz, Indiana, you tell the family that Kurtz Nazarene Church will cook any food they want for any number of people they want. We will go and serve it any place they want. We will set it up, we will serve it, we will clean it up, we will get out of your way, and we will give a grieving family one less thing to worry about on the day that they bury their loved one. And he said, since then, we have done that for every single funeral in this region. And we have touched every single family in this region. And we're standing in his office at the time. And he said, actually, on Monday, I'm starting to unpack my office. I gotta pack my office up. I said, you're not leaving, are you? He says, oh, no. We've got like this basically closet down the hallway. I mean, it's much smaller, but I'll fit in there. It's good for my office. I'm moving out of this into the small place. I said, why are you doing that? Well, he says, as you can tell, when you're standing in here, this is the only room that you can see into the sanctuary from through the 2 windows. I go, yeah. He goes, so we're going to turn this into the nursery because for the first time in over a decade, we have babies in the church. Church Growth Through Funeral Receptions is the title of my next book. It to me is the best illustration that I know of your church does something well, and you may not be recognizing it because it may not be the thing you're looking for. If a church can reach the community and find a strength in literally burying their congregation members, if they can find a strength to build on from that, then there's something in your congregation that you do well that you can build on as well. I don't know what it's going to be, but there's something that you can do. And so what I want to walk through in this session is how to discover that in your congregation. For centuries, for generations in Europe and in North America, churches were the center of community life, especially in small towns. You used to be able to drive through a state like this, and you could see the small town coming because you'd see the steeple of the church before you saw anything else. And you'd get to the town, and you'd ask somebody directions to get to such and such, and they'd say, yeah, you go to the steeple there and you turn left or you turn right. At night, when kids were bored, they'd hear that there was some traveling evangelist, some crazy person down at the church, and they'd go and they'd just go in there just to laugh at what these people were doing. Or there'd be the harvest festival and it's down at the church. Or they needed food and they go to the church food pantry. Or they needed clothes and they'd go to the church clothes pantry and everything or they didn't know the time it was and they'd hear the chime in the steeple and they'd know it was 11:30. Everything from directions to the telling the time to being entertained to getting their needs met to I'm single and I want to marry somebody, so I'm going to go to the single mingle down at the local church, to finding a spouse. So much of it was done through the local church, and in many small towns especially, the local church was the center of that community life, even for people who did not necessarily attend that church. That is no longer the case, because everything I just described is available on your phone. We don't need the church to tell time, to tell directions, to find a mate, even to get help. You can put it out on a GoFundMe on your phone. Everything that I just described is now available on your phone. So some of the questions that people are asking about why aren't people attending church as often, some of it is simply because a lot of those ancillary things that we help people do are now available elsewhere, cheaper, easier, and without having to go through all the challenge of actually getting to know real people. Right? And so for a lot of people, it's just easier to do it on my phone than it is to show up physically in a place and have to actually say hello and actually get to know people and then ask them a question and get the thing. And so it's not on their list of ways that they get those things done. So part of what we need to ask in our churches is, what can your church do that your phone can't do? Because even if you're talking about just simply hearing a great sermon on Sunday morning, they can get that on their phone too. Right? In most of our churches, they can get better worship music on their phone than they can get in most of our churches too. So even when you add that to the mix, what is it then that our church can do that our phone can't do? And that's part of what we need to think about, what we need to understand, and what we need to lean into. And we'll be talking about that in these next two sessions. Back in the day, back several generations ago, when almost everyone in our culture attended church, we had some interesting ways of measuring what a successful ministry was, and it basically came down to attendance. And this idea of keeping attendance as the single measure of successful ministry is still hanging on, but it's like the vestigial tail that is going to have to drop off soon because it doesn't have the application it used to. And here's part of the reason why. Back when pretty much everybody attended church, and there was a long season of history where in Europe and in North America especially, where we were more or less Christian in our orientation, and a great majority, in some places 70 to 80 to 90% of people attended some kind of a church. And when everybody in the community is going to church anyway, then success in ministry means, well, more people attend my church than attend your church. That is not a correct way to measure success, but that's what we did. And when pretty much everybody is going to church, it kind of made some sense. There was a logic to it. It was a false logic. It was a false measure of success, but at least it had some logic to it. If everybody's going and I've got the biggest piece of the pie, then I'm successful. Again, faulty, but at least you can see that there's a logic to it. Now that church attendance, well, as we talked about earlier, church official membership is below 50%. In many, maybe most places, church attendance is down into the 20s to 30%. I was at a conference not long ago in New England, northern New England, And one of the people who got up and spoke before me said that there are actually several counties in northern New England, in Maine and Vermont, I believe it was, where the declaration of Christian faith in the community is so low that they actually qualify as an unreached people group. That's how small the church attendance is. If they were in another country, we'd refer to them as an unreached people group. That's how few people have a declaration of faith and attend a local church. And that is kind of what's happening, as we talked earlier about being post-Christian. So now that we're there, the idea that my church is bigger than your church, which was never a good way to measure success anyway, is now just simply nonsense. Because now we've got so many people who are unreached and who need to be reached and who need to have a relationship with Christ and who aren't going to church, that it has to be about something else. It can't be about attendance anymore. So what does it have to be about? Here's what it is. The impact, especially of small churches, has to be more about influence than attendance. It has to be more about influence than attendance. I want you to imagine that in a particular small town or in a neighborhood in a large city, that in that neighborhood or in that small town community, there are going to be about a dozen to 20 people maybe, who have an outsized influence on that community. And I'm not talking about the mayor or the owner of the biggest business in town. I'm talking about average people, but who are just connected people, and they just know people. And if you were to ask around town, you'd find out that just about everybody in town knows several of those dozen or 20 people, because they're just influencers. They're just there. They're not trying to be, they're not doing it online. It's the single mom, and it's the plumber, and it's the UPS delivery person, and it's people who just are connected with people, and they're an influence, and they're a part of that. And then I want you to imagine that dozen to 20 people who have an outsized positive influence in their community, they discover each other and realize, wow, we're really having a lot of impact. Why don't we meet every once in a while and figure out how we can have an even better impact if we actually talk to each other and help each other? So they sit down once a week and they talk about how do we have a better, more positive impact on the community. And then I want you to imagine that dozen to 20 people who already have outsized influence and who sit down once a week to figure out how they can have even a better positive influence on their community. I want you to imagine that dozen to 20 people are your church members. Pause for that for a moment. If the dozen to 20 people in your church, and let's say, because we've got people in the room whose churches are in the dozen to 20 range, right? What if that dozen to 20 people were the dozen to 20 biggest influencers for positive gain in your community around you? All of a sudden, wouldn't it change the way you pastor, the way you think, the way you lead, the things you do when you gather together? So imagine that's what your church looks like. So then what sometimes happens is when I say this, because I've had this reflected back to me, well then what if that dozen to 20 people grew to 100 people or 200 people, and we had that kind of massive impact? And at that point I got to go, no, stop, that's not how it works. Influence leverages small numbers for impact, but it doesn't scale for crowds. You can have a dozen to 20 people who have an outsized impact, like an impact more than 200 or 300 other people. But once you start getting to 200, 300, 400 people, the individual influence of those people starts to wane. Now, a church of 200 can have a greater influence than a church of 20, and a church of 20 can have a greater influence than a church of 200. So the church in size itself can have a big influence. But when you're wanting to talk about per capita influence in a community, that's actually going to happen more often in a smaller church than in a larger church, but only if we recognize the possibility and we are intentional about it. So we can have a greater influence than the numbers of our church would say. And so we need to start asking ourselves, where is our influence in our community, or where can we have it? Just like that little church in that tiny little, practically non-existent town, they've had an influence for 30 to 40 miles in every direction on that entire community of all these agricultural places where people are separated by many, many, many miles. And that tiny little church, when they started doing it, were well under 50 people. And they now have an outsized influence on that entire region because they found one thing that they can really help with, that they offered their services for, something they were already doing that they said, we're now going to do it well. And they've had influence. Now, the interesting thing is even the bigger churches are seeing this importance of influence. A little while ago, Kerry Newhoff wrote an article entitled "Engagement is the New Attendance." And he's right when you're talking about bigger churches. In bigger churches, they'll have increased attendance, but their challenge is getting the people engaged. And here's why. If you want to go to a church and just sit in the back and be passive and anonymous, what size of church are you typically going to pick? A big church. Healthy big churches know this, which is why they know they're constantly pushing back against passivity and anonymity by talking about small groups and ministry teams. Every healthy big church is talking about trying to get the members onto ministry teams and into small groups because they're having to fight the passivity. The challenge in small churches isn't passive people. It might be passive-aggressive people. So the problem in small churches isn't to get the members engaged. Sometimes they're too engaged. The challenge in the small church isn't to turn passivity into engagement. It's to turn engagement into influence. So the big church is trying to move them from passive to engaged. In small churches, we're trying to move them from engaged to influential, to try to impact. You can use the word impact or influence however you want, but that's what we're trying to get to. So for small churches, influence is the new attendance. Now, how do we start getting there? Let me walk you through a simple illustration. There's an old story about a man who's walking around a farm, and he comes around the side of a barn, and on that other side of a barn, there's been a guy shooting arrows into the side of the barn. And as he looks at the side of the barn, he sees there are 5 perfectly painted targets and 5 arrows, and each arrow is dead center of one of those targets. So 5 targets, 5 arrows, 5 bullseyes. And he looks at the archer and goes, wow, you must be practicing a lot to get 5 bullseyes. That's amazing. And the archer doesn't say anything. He goes over and he pulls the 5 arrows out of the side of the barn, puts them in his quiver, walks around the other side of the barn. There's nothing on that side of the barn except the big old barn door. And 5 times, the archer takes the arrows out of his quiver, 5 times aims for the barn door, and 5 times misses the barn door completely. And the person who's watching it thinks, well, maybe it's because he's got an audience. Is he nervous because I'm here? Because he hit 5 targets dead on before, and he can't hit the side of a barn. He can't hit the barn door this time. This is what's going on. But the archer's not upset. What the archer does after he shoots his 5 arrows is he goes over into a paint can, and he picks up a paintbrush, and he paints 5 targets around where the 5 arrows hit. This is a great illustration of how to begin to discover and do what your church does well. I want you to imagine that instead of shooting 5 arrows, the archer shot 100 arrows. What you'll discover if you shoot 100 arrows is you'll start to see some patterns emerge. You'll notice that the arrows will tend to clump. Maybe 50 of them will still land randomly. But 25 of them will clump up in this general area, and maybe another 25 will clump up in this area. And you look at it and you see the patterns and you go, okay, I'm hitting those 2 spots a lot by mistake. If I draw a big target around those 2 spots and then I do it intentionally, if I'm hitting them a lot by mistake, imagine how much more I'll do it if I'm aiming there intentionally. So what does that mean for us as churches? What we need to do is we need to continue to shoot arrows. What's the shooting arrows? The Jesus stuff. Let's do what we know every church should be doing, but now pay attention to what works and why. So continue to do what you're doing. Maybe do a few new things, experiment. Here's another little church leadership hack for you. Anytime you start a new ministry, do it as an experiment with an expiration date. If you give every new ministry an expiration date, you will never have a failed ministry ever again in your church. Because if it doesn't work, well, it just reached its expiration date and you don't re-up it. So we discovered this about 15 years ago, and since then we haven't had one failed ministry, because every ministry you start has an expiration date. We're going to try this for the year, or we're going to try this for the summer. And if at the end of the summer it doesn't work, we just stop doing it at the time we said we'd stop doing it. No failure, it reached its expiration date. But if it does work, we keep going. So you get a chance to experiment with it. So you do the things you know you're supposed to do. You love God, you love others, but now pay attention to the patterns. So if you do 10 different things, and 5 of them work and 5 of them don't work, don't worry about the 5 that didn't work. Pay attention to the 5 that did work and ask, what do they have in common? Is there a theme here that makes sense? And then as you add more and you see more failures and more successes, don't worry about the arrows that landed at random. Take a look at the arrows that have a theme to them, and then you discover, oh, we do this well. Like Kurt's Nazarene Church, they were doing a whole bunch of things badly. He was really frustrated. And he found, wait a minute, Look at where a lot of these arrows are landing. We keep going to all these funerals, and we do them well. Let's do that on purpose now and see if we can turn that into something for the benefit and blessing of everyone. So do what you know to do. Do the Jesus stuff. Do the church stuff. But now pay attention to what works. Ask yourself why it works and see if you can see a pattern. See, I'm not interested in giving you ideas that we did at our church or the cool new trend in churches somewhere else and telling you, hey, here's what other churches are doing, do that. What I'm interested in is each church discovering what God has already put in your DNA and that you are already doing well, and now leveraging that for the impact of the kingdom of God. That's what we're talking about here. So do what you know to do. Keep shooting arrows. Now pay attention to it. Ask yourself what works and why it works. And then, after you discover what your church does well, do it on purpose. Right? Kurt's Nazarene Church was already doing awesome funeral receptions without even knowing they could do it. And now they do it on purpose, and now they're blessing their community with a thing they were already doing well. Years ago, our church discovered that as well. One of them was youth. And it was actually interesting during the break. Ty, where are you, Ty? There he is. Ty just moved to this area a couple years ago from Orange County, which is where I'm from. So he said he was talking to the folks at the table and going, I think I know where that church is. I wonder where it is. It sounds like that church that has a skate park. And then a few minutes later I talked about, we have the skate park. And he went, he knows exactly where our church is. There are a lot of people in our area, a lot of kids especially, they do not know the name of our church. No idea what our church's name is. It's just Skate Church. And we're fine with that. We're Skate Church. That's part of what we do, because we discovered years ago that was a need and we were able to meet it. So, first of all, do what you know you're supposed to do. Pay attention to what works and why. After you discover what works and why it works, then continue to do it on purpose. And then after you continue to do that on purpose, the next step is this. Front load the value. Feature what you do well. Here's another example. There's a tiny little church in a tiny little town called Ione, California. Way up in Northern California, up in the woods. And there is a state penitentiary next to the town. And there are more men in the state penitentiary than there are people in the town. The people in the town refer to it as our friends in the gated community. I just love that. And so there's this little tiny church in this little tiny town. And years ago, they started noticing that because the men are in the state penitentiary next to the town, the women who are connected to them, the wives and girlfriends of the men who are there, were moving to their town along with their kids, quite often for just a few months or a few years, so that they were close enough and they could visit their husband or boyfriend or the father of their children and could visit them more easily. But they would show up and they typically did not have much money, had very little way to earn money, and the kids were running around the community and making a mess of things. And this church just started to have a burden for these kids. Everybody else was getting mad at them and kicking them out, and they just thought these kids need to be loved on just like our kids need to be loved on. How can we help them? So what they actually did was they went to the schools and they asked the teachers, what can we do to help the kids that will help them in your classrooms? And every teacher said the same thing. These kids need backpacks. They come first day of school, we give them all their books, they lose them or they get them all busted to pieces because they got nothing to carry them home in. So they're just carrying them in their hands. They don't have backpacks. The kids need backpacks. So they didn't have the money to do it, so they found a ministry called Rural Compassion, and they're actually out of Springfield, and they'll help any church that you want. So if you get a hold of Rural Compassion, they supply these things, and they showed up with truckloads of backpacks, and they gave away backpacks, and 2 or 3 times a year now, they do a backpack drive at the beginning of the school year, they do a boot drive at the beginning of winter. I can't remember what it is they do for the summer, but 2 or 3 times a year they'll do a big drive for that, and they will help these kids who are there just for a short season while their dad is in prison, and they will help them get along, keep warm in the winter, and keep all their books together during the school year. Now, this is not a recipe for church growth, because those kids are going to leave soon. Okay? This is one of the challenges I have sometimes with some of the church growth ideas, is that they'll look at an idea like this and go, well, that isn't going to grow the numbers, so we're not going to do it because it's not going to grow the church. But it is the right thing to do. And sometimes we just need to do the right thing because it's the right thing. There's a couple of verses in Scripture about widows and orphans. God kind of really cares for them a whole lot. And they're not technically widows or orphans, but yeah, they're close enough that I think Jesus' heart goes there too. Okay, I'm just gonna. So that's what they did, and they reach out to them on a regular basis. And so this church is now known as the Church that Cares for Kids. They've got that banner on their church, on their website, on their Facebook page. Every time I look at it, it still hasn't changed. They've got the name of the church there, but the banner is always the Church that Cares for Kids. Literally, the name of the church is sometimes obscured by the banner that says the Church that Cares for Kids. If you go to Ione, California today and you ask people where is and give the name of the church, most people won't know what you're talking about. But if you ask where's the Church that Cares for Kids, almost everybody in town will know. So that's all they do is kids. Now, some people may say, okay, well, if all they're doing is caring for kids, what about the grown-ups? What about the adults? They're leaving everybody out, aren't they? Well, first of all, hang on there. No, they're not. Because kids need parent figures in their life and grandparent figures in their life and older kids who they can look up to. But basically they tell everybody, if you come to our church, you don't have to be a kid, but you have to be about kids. Because that's everything we do. So again, if you want to look at it and go, but they're only doing kids, they should do more than that. Here's the deal. They used to do nothing well. They were trying to do everything and didn't do any of it well. Now they do one thing and they do it extraordinarily well. So should we go back to trying to do everything and doing all of them poorly, or should we concentrate on one thing and do it exceptionally well? They've decided to find one thing and do it exceptionally well. It's because they saw a need. They knew that they had the ability to help out. They could make that connection. So they discovered what they want. And now they front load the value. They have called themselves the Church that Cares for Kids. And you don't have to wonder what that church is about. Everything that they say, everything that they do, everything that they print, everything that they put online has as its lead line the Church that Cares for Kids. You cannot touch that church without knowing that. So nobody comes in and is there a few months and then realizes, oh, we got to do kid stuff? No, you can't get in the building without knowing that. Right? So front load it. That way, nobody's confused. Nobody's upset by it. If they want to buy it, they buy it. If they don't want to buy it, they don't want to buy it. By buy, I mean, buy in, right? So let's walk through it again, okay? So what do? Shoot arrows. Do the things we know the church is supposed to do. Pay attention to what's working in your church and why it's working. See those patterns. After you discover the pattern, then do it on purpose. If you've been doing it a lot by mistake, you'll do it even better if you do it on purpose. And then front load the value. Put it out front so that everybody knows this is the thing our church is about. And the challenge then becomes, if we're going to simplify things, how do we say goodbye to things that we used to do? I talked a little bit about it last night during the COVID season, but now that we're past, or just about past that, and most of us are back to our regular schedules again, how do we start to simplify things, which means we're going to have to stop doing some things that we used to do? People who live in big cities have a rule. They call it the closet rule. And the closet rule is this. If you live, let's say, in Manhattan, and for $4,000 a month, you're renting this little studio apartment, and it's got a closet that's 3 feet wide, and that's it. And that's about the numbers. And you've got this 3 foot wide closet, and you can barely afford the rent. But you work in the fashion or banking industry, or in some way, every time you go out, you're judged by what you wear, so you've got to keep up on the latest clothes. They have a thing they call the closet rule. And the closet rule is very simple. You don't put a new garment into the closet until you take an old garment out. You replace the old with the new. Now, in a lot of our churches, we are trying to do too many things. We've got too much stuff in our church program closet. Some of us physically, right? It's the clutter in the back. I remember the first church we went to, that little chapel in the Redwoods that I told you about. When we got there, there were 3 cribs in the nursery, and one of them was literally broken and like sharp points pointing inwards. Like, yeah, we just don't put kids in that one. Because why is it still in here? So my first Monday, I'm hauling it out to the garbage, and as I'm hauling it out, one of the church members drives by and pulls into the parking lot, looks at me and goes, "What you doing there, Pastor?" I go, "I'm tossing this in the garbage." And she goes, "Oh, that's not what we do to those things in our church." I go, "What do you do?" She goes, "See that shed there? Yeah, we put it in that shed right there, and then we wait a few years until it gets completely messed up, and then we throw it out." And she had this little smirk on her face. And I went, "Oh, okay, I get what you..." So you're telling me I should check the shed? Yeah, check the shed too, this way. So, I don't know where I was going with that one, but it was one of those. Closet rule, okay? So some of us have too many physical things that we need to get rid of, but more than anything else, most of us are over-programmed. But how do you say goodbye to programs that used to work and that people may still love to put new things in? So the closet rule for ministries is simply this. You don't add a new program until you've dropped an old program. And some of our churches need a 2-for-1 sale. Okay, we do. I used to do this for years. I'd go to conferences like this, and they'd come up with some new idea, and I'd come back and go, okay, this is the answer. We're going to do this now. It got to the point that the people in the congregation dreaded every time I went to a conference. Like, what's it going to make us do now? And it wasn't that they didn't want to do it. It's that they were tired. Here's an example of how we did it in our church not long ago. A couple summers ago, at the beginning of the summer, the woman who had been overseeing our kids' ministry told me that by the end of the summer she wasn't going to be able to do it anymore. And we didn't have anybody to replace her. It was one of the areas before we really put our full discipleship process in place. And we didn't have anybody who could come in and back her up. We had a couple people who were helping her, but they weren't leaders. They hadn't been trained for that yet. At the time, we were running an internship program, and we knew that at the internship program started in September, we were going to have an 18-year-old girl come into the program who wanted to do kids ministry but had never done it before. So I realized that by the end of the summer, I have to figure out how to redesign our kids ministries program so that it could be run by an 18-year-old who'd never done it before. Apollo 13 table, right? That's what I had to work with. So I looked at what we did at kids ministries and I wrote it down, and it was 5 different areas. It was Sunday morning, it was Wednesday night, it was VBS, and 2 other things. We did 5 main things for kids. And then I looked at them and asked myself, what's our order of priority? So I put them in order of priority. Sunday morning first, and then all the way down. This is the most important, this is the least important. And then I looked at that list and I asked myself, what would happen if we stopped doing those 4 things and only did the one thing? If we just had something good on Sunday morning for kids, so when their parents came, they had a place for their kids. And I went to the 2 volunteers, and I presented that to them, and they looked at me and they said, can we do that? I was like, well, I'm the pastor and I'm suggesting it, so I'm thinking, yeah, I guess we can do that. And I said, what would be your response? And you know what the response was? Relief. Here's why. In a big church, if you're doing 5 different kids programs, you've got a different set of leaders in each of the 5 programs. But in a small church, if you're doing 5 different kids ministry programs, you've got the same people doing all 5. And they're tired. So we said, you know what, we're not going to do those 4. We're going to come up with a program that can be run by an 18-year-old who's never done it before, with 2 volunteers who have not been trained into leadership. And that Sunday morning thing got real good. I mean, I'm talking about second or third week into it, we had kids who were going back to it who had not been going back to it. We had 7 and 8-year-olds who preferred sitting and listening to me on Sunday morning rather than being in our kids program. That means you've got a problem with your kids program, right? All of a sudden they couldn't wait. It didn't get bigger, but it was enthusiastic. And eventually, yeah, that was the thing they wanted to invite their friends to. And this has been years ago. That's still all we do for our kids. We do Sunday morning, and that's it. We haven't started our VBS back up again. We haven't started our trunk or treat back up again. We haven't started our midweek back up again. We just do Sunday morning really well. And we will do that until our closet grows. And what grows our closet? If we have more volunteers, if we have more kids, if we have the facility to match what we need to do. There are different ways that our closet grows, but until our closet grows, or until we can, if we're going to add something to it, we're going to remove something. So we've simplified it and we've gotten better at what we do. So that's the closet rule. Don't add a new program until you've dropped an old program or ministry. And how do you get to the point then where you decide which programs are we going to get rid of? Here are 2 questions that every church needs to ask that most churches never think to ask. What does your church do well that you'd like to do more of? What does your church do poorly that you'd like to do less of? Right? It's not about what the trends are in churches. It's not what the cool church down the street is doing or in the next town over is doing. What are you already doing well? Funeral receptions? Sunday morning with kids? Backpacks for kids in the community? Those are the things they're doing well. So they said, let's do more of them. But in order to do more of that, you've got to do less of the things you're already doing poorly anyway. So it's not even about the value of the ministry, because you can have 5 ministries that all have great value, but you can't do all of them well. So you can't decide on value because they've all got equal value, but because you're trying to do all of them, you're not doing any well. So instead of deciding on value, if they've all got equal value, pick the one you do best. Lean into your strengths. There's too much teaching out there about, in order to grow, we've got to find the area of weakness and make that strong and make it equal to the others. And most of the time, all that does is leave you frustrated. The book Soar With Your Strengths talks about this. And they talk about, right, the rabbit and the fish and the frog, or the bird or whatever it is, right? And it's like, the rabbit's not flying very well, so let's give the rabbit flying lessons. And the bird's not swimming very well, so let's give the bird swimming lessons. And the fish isn't hopping very well, so let's give the fish hopping lessons. No! That's not what they're designed to do. You're a bird, or you're a rabbit, or you're a fish. If you're a fish, learn how to swim better. If you're a rabbit, learn how to hop faster. If you're a bird, learn how to fly better. And don't worry about what the others are doing. So, again, let me walk you through the process here. We do what we know we're supposed to do, but pay attention to what works. After we know what works, do it on purpose. And then let everybody know about it by putting it out front. And then after you've decided this is the thing we're going to do, we look around and we ask ourselves, then what do we need to get rid of so we can put even more of our time, our energy, and our resources into this one thing we do well, by asking ourselves, what do we do well that we'd like to do more of? What do we do poorly that you'd like to do less of? And one of the ways to decide on the poorly one is this. Ask yourself a question. If you were starting the church today, is there anything that you're doing right now that you wouldn't start? This is a question we ask on a regular basis, especially coming out of COVID, we ask this. If we look at the program, we go, if we were starting the church today, is this at the program we would want to start now? And if the answer is no, then that's probably a good sign that that may be one of the ministries not to do. Maybe for a season, maybe forever, I don't know. But those are hard questions, but they need to be asked. And then as we move along, we need to do this. Move out of a destination mindset and into a process orientation. Now let me explain what each of these mean. First of all, many, maybe most of our churches were built with a destination mindset. And let me give you an example of it, but not the only example of it. A destination mindset sometimes looks like this. Okay, we're going to start a church, so we're going to buy a piece of land, we're going to build this building, we're going to bolt these pews to the floor, we're going to sing out of these hymn books, we're going to put this denominational name on the sign, we're going to get a big old pulpit with a plaque on the side that says, don't you move this pulpit until everybody in the family who donated it has died. Once again, I know my audience. And then it takes so much time, so much energy, so much money to get there, that when we get there, we go, oh, we have a church. And when you arrive at a destination, what do? You stop. I've arrived. I can stop moving. I park the car. I'm home. And so we do this. We get to this destination because we got this picture. Once the picture happens, we stop. And then 20 years later, we look around and we go, how did we lose touch with the community? Because they kept moving. And you arrived at a destination and stopped. I've been in some of the churches. I know. We're looking around, the community's moved on, and I go into some churches and I look around and go, they haven't even dusted the fake plants on the stage in a decade. Right? And they can't figure out how they've lost touch with the community. Because we arrived at a destination and we stayed, instead of continuing the process. So how do we move from a destination mindset to a process orientation, and what does that mean? Okay, I want you to imagine that you want to run a marathon. You never run before, but there's a quarter-mile track behind the high school next to your house. So you got on that quarter-mile track, you're all excited the first morning, and you're going to run around it 5 or 6 times, and after the first time around, you're, and that's it, you got one around, and that's it. But you're determined, so the next day you go, and after one around, you're not quite as tired. And the day after that, you actually go around 2 times. And at the end of 4 or 5 weeks, you're going around 4, 5, 6, 10 times. After a couple months, you are just going around that track and going around. Take a look at what my finger is doing. This is a process. A process has 2 ingredients. It has motion, and it has consistency. Motion and consistency. What we tend to do with a destination mindset is this. We arrive here, we go, this is church. We don't change anything for 20 or 30 years. Then we look around and go, uh-oh, we're in trouble. We've lost touch with the community. And then we just dramatically change everything from here to boom, there. And we just make this big change. And then boom, over here, right? We go to a conference. We're going to change everything. And everybody's kind of left reeling. Why? Because we're not doing it with any kind of a process. When you have a process, motion always continues, so you never just stop. But there's predictability to it. So let me give you an idea of what the process looks like in our church. I'm not telling you to do this in your church. I'm giving you an example so that you have an idea what I'm talking about. In our church, we have a very simple process, and it's this. We are always improving our least effective ministry, and we are always improving the least effective part of our building. That's our process. There is never a time when a ministry is not under construction, and there is never a time when a part of our building is not under construction. Ever. Ever. I came to a church that hadn't changed anything in 10 years because they'd gone through the series of short-term pastors, and then for the first 7 to 8 years that I was there, we were just too tired and exhausted to do anything. So by the time we started looking around, we were like 20 years of having to fix up the ministries and having to fix up the building. And I had a good 10 to 15 years of just trying to keep the building from falling down over my years. And at that point, I said, you know what? When we finally got to the point where everything was healthy, I said, we're not going to stop because an object at rest tends to stay at rest. Now that we're in motion, let's keep it in motion. So we set up the process. So we always ask, what is our least effective ministry and how can we fix it? And it always leads with ministry. And then after that, what is the least effective part of our building? Because sometimes after you improve the ministry, then you go, oh, and now it doesn't fit this part of the building, so now we have to fix this part of the building in order to work for how we've adapted the ministry. But always lead with ministry. So our process, again, take or leave it or edit it or whatever you need to do. We are always improving our least effective ministry and then improving the least effective part of our building. And there's always motion. And people in our church simply know there's always going to be forward motion. It's part of what we do. That is our process orientation. So, we think that people can't handle process, but they can. Because we think people are afraid of change, but they're really not. Here's the deal. Churches can handle change, but they don't like to be surprised. That's what I found to be the biggest distinction. We think people are change averse, and some people are. But more than anything else, especially the church, we're not change averse as much as we are surprise averse. If people know why the change is happening, if you can give them a process and your changes fit into the process, the consistency of the process gives them their comfort level. So that they can go with the changes. What they're looking for is a place they can feel comfortable and know it's not going to go crazy. But instead, we have a destination mindset, we lock it down, we don't change for 20 years, and then we change everything like crazy and don't really give them a reason why, and then we think, well, they just don't like change, I'm never changing anything again. And they're probably not against the change as much as they are against being surprised. If they don't know why the change is happening, we'll get more pushback. Now, you will get some pushback even with proper changes that you explain correctly, because there's always going to be that person. We already talked about that person last session, right? That's always going to be there, I get it. You can't get rid of it completely, but you can get rid of most of it by putting a good process in place. Churches can handle change, they don't like to be surprised. So how do we reduce surprise? First of all, the process does that. Secondly, this is something I discovered when I came to our church almost 30 years ago. Give the leaders time to ponder big decisions. When I came to the church, actually, the leaders of the church actually came to me and they said, they helped me with this. They were the ones who said to me, you know what? We love you as a pastor. We've supported all of our pastors. But the only time we've ever had an issue is when the pastor goes and changes something and we as a leader aren't even informed. And then people come to us and go, why do we make that change? And we don't even have an answer. We're not wanting to control you. We just want to do our job faithfully, and part of doing our job faithfully is knowing what's happening and why. So if you can just at least keep us up to speed in advance of things so that we can support you, we can help you, we can see it forward, and we can explain it to others. And I thought that is a reasonable request. So here's the promise I made. I told them this. If there's ever a big change to be made, or when there's a big change to be made, I promise you this. I will never present that change and ask you to make a final decision about that change in the same meeting. I will always give you at least one meeting's advance notice. So here's how it actually worked out. At about the 7 or 8 year point, when we looked and said, hey, we've got a healthy church, part of our assessment of moving forward as we started reaching the community was, we realized that our church had a bad reputation in the community, and part of it was connected to our name. So I'm not going to tell you what the name of our church was, because some of you may have that name. It's a fine name, it just had a bad reputation in our community. So I said, we need to change our church name. And I thought about it and prayed about it for months, because it's a big deal, even to bring it up. And I thought, okay, I think we need to do this. So at the end of our deacon meeting, I turned to everybody and said, okay, big idea time. And what that means is this. I'm going to present the idea. We're going to pray about it. We are not going to talk about it. You're going to go home, and you're not even going to talk about it to the other members until we come back next month for our next deacons meeting, and only then we'll talk about it after all of you have had a month to think and pray about it on your own. So I brought up the idea, we need to change the name of the church. Here's why. Pray, go home. Next month we come back to the next meeting. End of the thing, I say, okay, big idea time. I re-present it to them, and I go, okay, you've had a month to think and pray about it. What do you think? The longest standing, most respected member of the board looked at me and said, Pastor, I heard you last month. And I can tell you what I thought. Nobody's changing the name of my church. I thought, oh, I'm in trouble. He said, but you know, since then we went on vacation. I said, I noticed you were gone the 2 Sundays. He said, yeah, we were at such and such a place. And on Sunday we were going to go to church, so my wife was reading off the names of some of the churches nearby. And she named one church, and I went, oh, I don't want to go there. That sounds like some dry old, boring church. And she looked at me and she said, Al, that's exactly the name of our church. Now, the reason he didn't recognize it is because we had gone by the initials for so long. And nobody in the church called it by its full name. We only called it by its initials, right? It was a CBC, right? So I won't give you the full name, but I'll give you the initials. So everybody just went to CBC, but he didn't know that, he'd forgotten it, just didn't hit it, and he heard that name, must be some dry old boring church. He went, that's the name of our church, and he went, oh, that's how people see our church. We have to change our church name. I gave the Holy Spirit a month, and he did my job for me. Now, why did that work? Well, the Lord had given me months to think and to pray before I was even ready to propose it, let alone actually do it. And what often happens in our churches is this, right? As a church leader, we'll think about it, we'll come up with an idea, so we'll explore it, we'll pray about it, we'll talk to other people about it, and then we'll present it to our other church leaders and expect them to make a decision in 20 minutes, and if they don't, we get mad at them and tell them they don't like change. The Lord gave you months, at least weeks for most of these big decisions. You got to give them the respect of time that God gave you. And if you give them the respect of time, they'll come along with you more often than you think. Now, I know this story. Of all the stories I've told, this is the one that I know strikes you as, that sounds like one of those made-up preacher stories, because there's no way a leader in the church forgot his church name. I mean, it just doesn't happen. So, just let me tell you this. This story is in Small Church Essentials, my second book. And when I wrote it, after reading through the copy, my editor at Moody actually emailed me and said, I got just one question. That story about the name change, did that actually happen? I said, yeah, it actually happened. He said, well, here's the deal. We need some proof. Because otherwise that's one of those crazy preacher stories that didn't really happen, but you want to make a point with. He said, the guy who that happened to, is he still around? Can you get a hold of him? I go, yeah, he's at church every Sunday. He goes, okay, great. Take that section of the book, copy it and paste it onto a letter, and have at the bottom where he and you sign to verify the truth of it. So I did that, I handed it to him, he read through the letter, he said, yeah, that's what happened, he signed it. So today, at Moody headquarters in Chicago, Illinois, there is a file cabinet with a piece of paper signed by the guy this happened, verifying the truth of the story I just told you, just so you know, right? Because otherwise, that story just doesn't ring true, but it actually happened. So we gave them time to ponder big decisions. It's not always going to come out like that. It hasn't always come out like that for me. But when you give people the respect of time, just like God gives us the respect of time, God is patient with us, let's be patient with others, especially for the big decisions. And then, when an emergency comes up and we just have to do it right away, they're more likely to trust you that it is an emergency and go along. Because they see that when it's not an emergency, you give them the time to consider it. And the smaller the church is, and the more the congregation has had to kind of step up and take leadership, if you've been absent a pastor for a while or whatever, the smaller the church is, the more you have to work like this with them and give them the opportunity to have buy-in. Bigger churches don't have to worry about this too much. Church of 2000, you don't sit around and ask everybody what they think of it. It just won't work. You just make the decision, you do it. It works or it doesn't. But in smaller churches, we had to have a higher percentage of buy-in from the congregation. And you won't get it if you're constantly presenting it and expecting them to make the decision right away. Give them the respect of time. All right? Now, we'll take a short break, and then we will come back to reaching the next generation, a proven 3-level strategy. Well, let's give you